say, okay, if we're going to adopt Agile, what are the necessary preconditions to adopt Agile? And you say, okay, well, I have to have whole complete teams, minimal dependencies. I have to have backlogs. I have to be able to have the ability to produce a working tested increment of software. Cool, right? That's the fundamental precondition for Agile. So what would I have to do to create those conditions over time, right? That's really the fundamental question you're asking yourself, because there's no easy button. You're having to pull this system apart, and you're having to rebuild it differently. How do I take my people, align them with the business, take the technology, align it with the people in the business, minimize dependencies so folks can operate with more local autonomy and make good decisions on behalf of the customers, right? Because that's what we're really trying to do. I'm going to explore something that I talk about quite a lot, and it's the idea of dependencies in Agile. Our industry is circling around something that I think is really interesting. So if we talk about just pure play Scrum, right, we have the idea of teams, backlogs, working tested software. So what's a team in Agile, right? 6 to 8 people that have some amount of autonomy over their technology stack. They don't have a ton of dependencies between them and other teams. They can operate off of a backlog. They can produce a working tested increment of software every sprint or so. This idea of dependencies, right? Anytime we have dependencies between teams, we have to orchestrate those dependencies in some ways. At the kind of the most simple level, if I have an occasional dependency, then I might walk across the room and ask somebody to help me resolve the dependency in the course of the sprint. And if they've got some capacity, they'll probably help me. If the dependencies are like heavy design dependencies, then those dependencies are really, really difficult to resolve during the sprint. Typically, when you have lots of dependencies between different parts of the organization, between different parts of the technology stack, between different requirements, it requires some sort of orchestration mechanism. So we've talked a lot about SAFe over the last couple months. And what I would suggest is that SAFe is really an approach to orchestrate dependencies across teams. Because if you didn't have dependencies between teams, you wouldn't need them. And so this idea that the industry's hunting around stuff. So last time I talked a little bit about this idea of Agile Open Digital that was part of this DoD spec that we've encountered quite a bit. Really similar to the stuff that Joe Justice is talking about with how Tesla and SpaceX are building cars and rockets. There's been, I've been getting turned on to from some of my tech teams, some of the stuff around domain-driven design. One of the things that Dennis Stevens, 15 years ago when we first met, was talking a lot about was the idea of business architecture. So I was hypothesizing last time that maybe a way of talking about this is thinking about the business architecture of the organization, the capability model of the organization, and the intersection of that and what the technology guys are really thinking about in terms of domain-driven design, right? So we want the business ultimately and the technology and the people to be in alignment, right? So you think about, we've got the business in alignment with the technology and the people, and you really have Scrum teams, right? You have encapsulated release trains, right? You have encapsulated value streams, right? So if you can pull that off. And so, gosh, even taking it one step further, right? One of the big buzzwords out right now is the idea of like product-driven organizations. What is that, right? If I want to have a product-driven organization instead of a project-driven organization, I'm basically saying the same thing, right? The product is the value, right? That's the alignment with the business. The product is the technology, and it's the people that build it, right? At some level, right? So a product-driven organization is fundamentally the same thing. You look at some of the stuff that's coming out right now around the composable enterprise, right? Well, what's a composable enterprise, right? Well, it's a Agile Open Digital kind of enterprise where the organization is in effect built of reusable components, right? So there's this idea, right? It's really interesting. It comes down to like what we've been hunting for forever in the Agile community. I was talking about a couple months ago, I was up in Raleigh, and I was, talking about, how you create a culture of agility, right? And we started talking about teaming strategies, and we started talking about where backlogs come from and what enterprise governance looks like and what we measure and what we control. And I told a story about one of my buddies that was out in the audience and, kind of raised his hand and said, that, well, as Agile coaches, we can't change the organizational structure. We can't change the teaming strategies. And I was kind of blown away, right? Because if we're not changing that, then what the heck are we really doing around here? And so you watch, right? So you look at, all this Gartner research, all the McKinsey papers, all the Accenture papers, the Deloitte papers, right? The stuff that's being published, the things that people are thinking about around this idea of composable enterprises, Agile Open Digital, the idea of product-driven organizations, right? It's all fundamentally the same thing. It's how do we get teams of people? How do we get them to align with the business? And how do we get them to have some, autonomy over the technology stack so we don't have to have this crazy level of orchestration between different parts of the enterprise? And so I think about it, right? Because we're in the change business. And so you start to ask yourself things like, well, why is it so difficult? And this is what I think is interesting, right? It's like, I think part of the challenge that we have right now is it's really difficult to see past your current constraints. And I think that's what the argument that Agile coach I was telling you guys about was making. It's like if the organization can't see past its current constraints, then what's available to us? I mean, it's like we're sitting there and we're saying, okay, well, we're going to buy some new packaged software. We're going to implement and devise some new technology. We're going to overlay some new process. But why is it that we get to this point where it's like the process keeps changing, the buzzwords keep changing, the angle of attack keeps changing, the products and software we offer keep changing. It's like we're constantly trying to hunt this holy grail of, some silver bullet. But at the end of the day, it comes down to encapsulation and orchestration, right? It comes down to that all the time. And I think one of the things that we need to sit in as a community, as a marketplace, as a movement in the Agile community, it's like if we can't figure out how to help companies create these kinds of teams, product-driven organizations, composable enterprises, Agile Open Digital, however you want to think about it, right? If we can't see past our current constraints and do this really for real, right? I hate to say something like lipstick on a pig, but that's fundamentally what we're doing here. So it's kind of fascinating, And I think part of the challenge, right? Part of the challenge is that as practitioners, even if we recognize it, we don't know quite what to do about it, right? We don't quite know how to orchestrate the change. If I'm a senior leader, then, I might have it delegated down to my people. And I don't really know necessarily, what are the underlying patterns that need to be changed. I'm kind of trusting the people up underneath me to do it. There's an element of how do we get the executives to understand that to do a product-driven organization, to do a composable enterprise, to do something that's Agile Open Digital, we have to fundamentally rethink the architecture of our systems. We have to fundamentally rethink, right, domain-driven design. We have to fundamentally think the architecture of our business, capability modeling. We have to fundamentally rethink how we orchestrate value and how we feed that system. If we want the benefits of this Agile, Open, Digital, Composable, Enterprise, Product-driven organization world, right, really all fundamentally saying the same kinds of things, it's fundamentally an encapsulation orchestration problem, right? It's the same problem that companies face taking legacy mainframes and trying to turn them into a services-oriented architecture. That might be kind of an interesting pattern to explore, because that's kind of like what we do in our transformation world. It's like if you were going to take a legacy system and you were going to refactor it into a microservice, containerized, cloud-based ecosystem, right, wrapped in tests, right, what would you do in the software? Well, you're really kind of doing the same thing to the organization. It's really fascinating. And I think that's the principle. I think that's the thing. That's like the core truth up underneath all of this. you get past the consultants, and you get past the process, and you get past the technology, you get past the resistance to change, and there's this pattern, right? There's this underlying thing that's up underneath what it is we're trying to do. How do we create encapsulated autonomous entities? And one thing that, again, I would challenge everybody to think is, I think what happens is that we hear that and we agree with it, and then we look at our organization as it is, and we can't see past the current constraint. We can't see how to change the organization in a meaningful way. We can't see how to launch a change program that will do that in a structured and disciplined way. And at the risk of being a little self-serving, but like, why else do all these videos, is that's kind of like what we do, right? And so I think of leading Agile very much like we're kind of a hammer looking for nails, right? And nails are everywhere, right? But at the point that somebody comes up to us and says something like, hey, we want to adopt Agile, right? That's usually kind of where we start. And we say, okay, if we're going to adopt Agile, what are the necessary preconditions to adopt Agile? And you say, okay, well, I have to have whole complete teams, minimal dependencies. I have to have backlogs. I have to be able to have the ability to produce a working tested increment of software. Cool, right? That's the fundamental precondition for Agile. And then you ask yourself something like, well, if I can't create those conditions, I'm not going to get the business benefit from it that I want. So what would I have to do to create those conditions over time, right? That's really the fundamental question you're asking yourself, because there's no easy button. You're having to pull this system apart, and you're having to rebuild it differently. So if it's like an Agile question, you have to start with that fundamental precondition. If I were going to use the same kind of metaphor on a system side, I might think about it something like this. As I have a legacy monolith that I want to move to the cloud. I have some legacy software that I want to move to the cloud. And you have to ask yourself, like, what would it take to be able to move that software onto that different platform? You could do it in a couple different ways. You could take that legacy platform and you could move it in the cloud, and I think they call that like cloud enabled or something like that. But there's a difference between cloud enabled and cloud ready, or cloud native. And so for something to really be cloud native, you really have to pull it apart, right? You have to make it more services oriented. You have to make it more containerized. You have to have it wrapped in APIs, and you have to have it in tests, right? In order to be able to fully exploit the cloud at that level. And so if somebody came to me and said, I want to adopt Agile, you'd have to work your way back to this encapsulation orchestration thing. If you want to do a cloud migration, you're really fundamentally having to think about it in the same way. Another word that keeps hitting my consciousness quite a bit is this idea of digital transformation. And one of the things that we're starting to see in the industry is like digital transformation has been largely treated as a technology problem. And now we're starting to see articles being written about why digital transformations are failing. And I think what's the reason why is because it's been treated as a technology problem. It hasn't been treated as a people and process problem. It hasn't been treated as an organizational design and a governance problem. It's like the inclination is to either want to put new technologies in place or to wrap the existing organization in a new set of processes or way of working or something like that. And at the end of the day, it's like once you see it, it's everywhere. Like you can't unsee it. What you've got to figure out how to do is you got to take the new digital technologies. You got to wrap them in people. You got to give them a more agile, lean governance framework to go in and try to experiment. So it's just like once you see this pattern, you just see it everywhere. It's fundamentally a teaming strategies problem. It's an orchestration problem. It's a dependency problem. And again, I just think the root of the reason why, I don't think that's hard to understand, and I don't think that most people would disagree. But again, the hard part is seeing past the current constraints. How do you get the people in the organization to understand that this is the problem en masse, right? And then how do you get executive buy-in to make the changes? And then once you get the buy-in, how do you manage and cost justify the change, right? All those things. And so Over the last couple of years, we've been doing some larger and larger agile transformation work, and our transformation work it's really interesting. It's not installing Scrum, right? It's very much in this space of digital transformation, cloud migration, technical uplift, right? And so we call it agile transformation, but all those things are the same thing, right? They're all in the same space. How do I take my people, align them with the business, take the technology, align it with the people in the business, minimize dependencies so folks can operate with more local autonomy and make good decisions on behalf of the customers, right? Because that's what we're really trying to do. And so I'll just say it one more time. If we can't figure out how to get past our current constraints and put together some sort of a plan for how we're going to actually create the conditions, we're just going to keep throwing dollars at this. We're going to keep throwing technology at it. We're going to keep throwing new process at it, new labels, right? But all at the end of the day, it's the same thing, right? It's alignment of people, process, technology, right? It's kind of consulting 101. But what does that mean? Encapsulation, orchestration, minimize dependencies. If you can't encapsulate, you have to orchestrate. You can't break dependencies, you have to manage them. And that's the problem. And so like what we really need is organizations that are decoupled, right? And that's why I've been kind of gravitating to that word composable enterprise for a while, because the idea of a composable enterprise, it really just seems to really marry kind of the systems view, the technology view, and the people view into one umbrella. So I've been using that word a lot. I'm trying it on a little bit. So interested in your thoughts. So give me a holler, make a comment. My team's trying to keep me up to date when you guys give me comments and things so I can go back in and reply to them. And super happy to engage and look forward to the conversation. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a great day. See you. Bye.